Good evening. Welcome to the 8th medicine session. And tonight we've got a wonderful discussion asking a very big question. My name is Josh Dugdale. I'm a council member on the Medicine Council. And tonight we're asking, how can tech support the communities of the future? It's a question which has many strands to it. But for those of us who believe in community, togetherness, unity, and the idea of oneness, it seems clear that great community is needed, especially now with what's going on in America and all of the issues that are flowing from division. To help us flow and to connect deeply with each other and the planet, we need community. And it's not just community with ourselves, it's community with nature. And we've invented some very powerful tools available to us as humans to help that. The internet is an extraordinary place, having made our lives both simpler and also much more complex at the same time. There's never a moment when our human mind is not trying to invent the next new thing which will resolve problems for us. However, when you sort one problem, another one might be right round the corner. And so it is with social media. And the big question is whether those tools are set up to help us or hinder us. Is it good medicine or bad medicine? So tonight, we've got a great panel. We've got Georgie Powell, who's the founder of Sentient Digital, a responsible technology and digital wellbeing consultancy, working with organizations to build strategies and products which have a positive impact on their teams and the world. She's also the co-founder of Space, the screen time app, and a former Google executive turned entrepreneur. She's a recognized expert and speaker on digital wellbeing. We also have Techno musician and entrepreneur Benji Vaughan, who is on a mission to change the world. Benji is the founder of community platform Disciple Media. Founded 4 years ago, Disciple Media aims to give independence to communities through ownership of their own networks. And finally, we have Patrick Walker. Patrick is the co-founder of Uptime, an app that delivers learning with purpose through expert curated videos. Formerly, he worked at Facebook as head of media partnerships and was responsible for launching and managing YouTube in Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. And in fact, I think he was the first ever European employee of YouTube, which is quite a thing to say. We'll be opening up for a Q&A, so please send in any questions in the chat. I can't promise we will answer all of them, but we will definitely be able to have time for a few, I'm sure. So I thought we'd dive straight in. We're not in normal times. We are in a situation where we're in the middle of a pandemic. And in America, we're suddenly seeing the rise of many communities rising up, mainly because of this whole issue with the story of the African American who was killed by a policeman, and that tells a story which is a story that's been going on in America for many years. But interestingly, through this and through this whole experience, which is flaring up in many cities in America, and igniting those divisions that they've had for so many years since slavery and beyond. And we now find ourselves where the tech solution for this, or the tech situation, is that Twitter have gone on and they have taken down a tweet of Donald Trump. And Donald Trump being the president of America, as of the most respected position in the West. And Twitter, a social media platform, has said that his message potentially is glorifying violence. And that illustrates the tightrope that some of these platforms are on. And I guess the question for us ultimately is, how can we use tech in a better way for our communities, and how can we support those communities and not go the other way? So I was going to ask Patrick to begin with if he could give us a little bit of insight into some of these challenges that the management of these large online social media platforms have in terms of deciding what can and can't be said. Patrick, do you have a view on this?
Yeah, I mean, it was always something that was top topic of discussion, inside the platform, also within YouTube. I was in Facebook from mid 2016 until middle of last year, And it was an interesting point. It was a turning point for the company where they went from being the darling in many ways, very positive sentiment amongst users, to one that, that trust began to be challenged, starting with the some of the issues around false news in the lead up to the US election, potential Russian interference, and then issues repeatedly around privacy. It became a little bit more difficult to defend that. And Facebook did a lot of work internally to develop teams that would try to adjust policies. And they did a lot of good work. They set up a lot of groups that were helping to support fact check efforts. But the fact is, it's a very, very large platform, over 2 billion users. And the technology, in my view, is neither good nor bad. It amplifies whatever's happening out in the world. And it became a place for people to share a lot of rage. And it also became a place where people, unfortunately, like in the world at large, started to become a little bit more polarized. We've learned more recently that these platforms really optimize for people to spend more time on them, and to enjoy and build community or bring the world closer together, as Facebook's mission states. But sometimes those algorithms, in optimizing for time well spent and optimizing for people to spend more time, may in fact be guiding people towards content that is a more extreme nature, or a place where outrage is considered engagement, and therefore people are getting served more of it. I didn't experience that myself. I was on the teams that was trying to mitigate those issues. But suffice to say, it's a very difficult challenge when you're so large and you have so many different countries simultaneously acting, and actions happening all over the world, that to keep track of it at such scale, it is a challenge, no matter how hard you try.
And I suppose a question that comes on from that is, these platforms are now they're so big, and they're so powerful, and there's so much responsibility on those that are making the decisions as to how they are going to manage certain issues as they come in.
Yeah.
Do you think, with this problem in mind, the solution can be found within these groups, or do you think that something new needs to come forward?
Yeah, well, they're going to keep doing what they can do, and I think they have a responsibility to maintain, clear and implement community guidelines. But those community guidelines are it's not so clear when it comes to who decides what's true and what's not. And so this is a very difficult challenge. And you see now in this dispute that Trump is having with Twitter and even with Facebook, even though Mark Zuckerberg seems to have been more open in allowing content, that Twitter has taken a stand on blocking, or at least putting warnings around. He's gone after both of them still. And I think it's going to be interesting to see where things go. Is he going to start to create more difficulties for them, to put them at greater legal risk if they're challenged legally, which seems to be what he's indicated in this new executive order. So it's quite concerning, no matter where you stand, that the president would be using these platforms to in some cases share information that was deemed to be inaccurate. And then when his wrist is slapped by, in this case, Twitter, he goes after and even threatens, he said, to shut them down if he could do it legally.
I have a slightly different kind of take on this one, if I can just jump in. I think Patrick makes a really good point, that trying to get to an ethical view on what truth is really difficult. And I know, Benji, you have some views on that, which would be good to hear. But I actually think there is a huge responsibility that technology companies have to recognize the consequences of the products that they build, and the consequences of those consequences as well, and to try and do what they can to mitigate the negative consequences that come about. And there is a way. It doesn't necessarily need to be through the auditing of content. There's a lot more that technology platforms can do to make it clearer to users about how their algorithms and their methodologies are influencing their content journeys through these sites. If more people understood the way that the data that they were sharing with these sites was subsequently used to inform the content that they saw, I think we would view it with perhaps more open eyes than we do. We often see this content being shared by friends or people who we believe are sort of trusted sources, and it further solidifies those beliefs in our mind, perhaps more than they would do if they came from an objective platform. But actually, what's being shown to us is a manipulation in many ways of the way that we've behaved before. So I think educating more people about how these platforms work would be very, very helpful, and there's a lot that technology can do to be more transparent in that way.
Yeah, if I can just step in on that point, I think one of the confusions that exists at a sort of population level is that that these platforms are somehow utilities and should therefore be treated like utilities when they're not. They're private companies who have the right to do whatever they want with their user and their content. So if Twitter decides, if Jack Dorsey decides that Donald Trump has stepped over a line that he chooses to set, he has absolute right to do that. And I think when people put their hand immediately up and question freedom of speech, it's not an impingement on freedom of speech to be told you can't say that on a private platform. You can go and say it, you can find another place to get your point across. But people have this, it's so centralized and concentrated, the world of social media, that ability to say, I've been, the Twitter won't allow my views so I can go somewhere else doesn't exist. Everyone is forced through 3 or 4 social media platforms. So I totally stand with Jack Dorsey's right to ban Donald Trump, ban him completely. But I think consumers need to understand more, citizens need to understand more. These are private companies. When they ban you, they're not impinging on your freedom of speech. Much in the same way, if I call up the Daily Mail and say I want to have an article on page 3 about vaccinations, they have the right to say, I'm not interested in having you in the Daily Mail. It's their right to choose what goes in their newspaper.
So the decision by Twitter to make that call was obviously one view, and then Mark Zuckerberg took another view, and the Twitter version was based on the glorifying of violence, and I suppose that's a relatively easy metric in some ways, because violence is shooting and looting is it's quite easy to connect that. But I guess it sometimes must be very difficult to make those decisions as to what is directly doing it or what is indirectly doing it. Patrick, did you experience that?
Yeah, no, it's extremely hard. And where you have a challenge in this case is the newsworthiness exception. This is the president of the United States speaking, therefore it's newsworthy. It's being covered in the news, and for them to remove it, in their view, would cause confusion or wouldn't be fulfilling their obligation to make sure that the president of the United States can communicate to the public. So this has been the dilemma that they've been in since he came to office. And Twitter has been criticized heavily for a very long time for not doing what they've just recently done. It's going to be interesting to see how this thing plays out. So, how do you justify taking down somebody else who does the exact same thing, but not take down the president? The newsworthiness exception makes that possible, but that's really untenable if you think about it. If you have an obligation as a public company, or publicly traded company as well, to make sure you're looking after people's well-being and you're trying to support a civil society and you're wanting to help create a place in which people can have meaningful dialogue, and you are in some ways turning a blind eye to abuse of these platforms, then you're going to also find yourself in difficult trouble with other people who are going to demand the same sort of right to share things that are untrue or otherwise inciting more division and even violence.
And it still feels like it's partly the Wild West in this arena. And I guess one of the things which can be troubling is this idea of how the algorithm works. Georgie, do you know about the way that these algorithms can work, potentially exploiting people it can be a negative way?
Yeah, I mean, only sort of to carry on from what Patrick already started talking about, in that if there are 2 pieces of content and they, the majority of views on YouTube, for instance, are driven by recommended videos, so it's auto-playing what you're next going to watch, you're not selecting your journey. If there are 2 potential videos that the algorithm is going to select to play next, it's more likely to play a more extreme video because that's more likely to keep you watching longer. And so you end up in these journeys which kind of can in many cases lead to more polarization from perhaps a neutral starting point. So there's the algorithms, which is part of one of it, but then there's also things like the tools like, for instance, autoplay or the endless scroll on YouTube or Facebook, which just lead people into a psyche when they're engaged with technology, which kind of removes their autonomy and in many ways their critical thinking as well. So it plays to our laziness, and before we know it, we're kind of being fed a content stream which, unbeknownst to us, may be polarizing our views, not always of course, but in some cases is, and it's kind of keeping us hooked at the same time, so we're watching more and more of it too. So it's kind of a combination of the tools as well as the algorithm, and then the content that exists as well.
Yeah, the platforms are extremely useful and they can be fulfilling in many ways. I mean, all of us during lockdown have been using these platforms, whether it's for live streaming, if you have an event, or connecting with family, or doing, games online and all these other things. But there is this aspect of what they're doing because it's an ad-supported platform. They need to drive more engagement. That's a commercial imperative, and therefore, the algorithms who are geared up to drive more engagement do tend to, and have tended to, and even the research has shown to guide people towards stuff that maybe they wouldn't or shouldn't be seeing. You have cases where you have people coming onto YouTube and legitimately thinking, after a trail of videos leading them to flat earthers, that the earth now is flat because they found it on YouTube, and that's a dangerous place to be. Now, I think there's a certain limitation when it comes to what these platforms can do. So you have to also put the responsibility on the individual, digital literacy, but you're also fighting against, highly addictive technologies and devices that are becoming more and more prevalent in our lives. And so even if you have this sort of education, do people have the agency? And will the platforms do enough to sort of inform people of the sort of addictive nature of what they built to change that behavior? I think what you need are new types of platforms and new types of opportunities that will complement these services to give people more choice. And that's sometimes difficult in this environment as well.
What I just on the point of how the algorithms have learned what makes us tick and then double down on those things. And one of those things that makes us humans tick, sadly, is outrage and hate. An interesting sort of story to put this in context is this is how the media's always operated. The algorithms have just put it into a sort of hyper mode. So a very good friend of mine who's a very senior British journalist, I remember him telling me a discussion he had with somebody at the Daily Mail who'd been there for years and years and years and understood the sort of overarching editorial framework of the Daily Mail. And the structure of the newspaper was the first 8 pages were fundamentally there to make you dislike somebody. It was stories about the other and the people you should be outraged and hate. The second half of the newspaper was designed to make you feel superior. And that's the model. And when you look at social media, when you look at most people's feeds, it's 50% making you feel superior and 50% making you hate somebody else. This is a well-modeled form of propaganda.
It's so true. Not just that, but with fake news too. I mean, fake news has been around. Manipulation of news has been around for hundreds and hundreds of years. I think Mark Twain said, by the time a lie has gone around the world, the truth is still lacing up its shoes. These technologies are so powerful; it amplifies instantaneously, globally, what would have taken longer to catch and mitigate. And this is one of the challenges. So, in a way, it's more to do with just the technology itself as opposed to these particular platforms, because if it was another platform, we'd have the exact same problem.
Yeah, I mean, I guess it's really difficult with freedom of speech, isn't it, generally? And as soon as you start moving that line and start interfering, it's a really difficult path to navigate. I
think freedom of speech, though, you have to be cautious because it's also seen differently in different countries, and a lot of people are claiming freedom of speech, but in fact, they just want to have freedom to cause all sorts of and spread all sorts of things that are highly dubious and questionable. YouTube actually recently has been quite aggressive in Facebook as well in taking down certain people for spreading very clear lies around COVID, and whether it be conspiracy theories or that it doesn't exist, which causes real world harm, right? And so they've had to take aggressive stances there. But it's kind of hard to do it at scale in so many languages in so many countries simultaneously, which is why a lot of these platforms have also had difficulties in countries like Burma or Sri Lanka or other places where they just haven't caught things that did lead to real world harm. And that's kind of a scary place to be in.
I mean, it's been hard enough for the UK to manage the Daily Mail in this country, and I guess when you spread it around the world, it becomes
yeah, exactly. It's the fun thing I find funny is that we've created a neutral algorithm, and it basically learned over the course of 15 years to act pretty much like propaganda's acted for 200 years.
Exactly. Yeah.
And I suppose at the root of it is the need for these businesses, which become very large, to make money and to bring returns to their shareholders, right? That's the model, and it's difficult to detach the two, or is it? Georgie, do you have a view on that?
No, I mean, as I said before, I think the business model, I agree, is a lasting problem, and unless that business model is changed, it's going to be hard to move away from an attention-based ecosystem. But you could still do a lot more to make your product responsible, transparent, accountable, by helping people to understand how those platforms work. I think there's a lot more as well that needs to be done around making sure the content that is available on these platforms is age appropriate. These platforms are all supposedly 13 plus, but there's content which you'd never, it's 18 plus in terms of a movie rating. We were quite quick at getting movie ratings happening. I don't really see why we can't be doing the same on our technology platforms too. So there's a big gap that is happening there with children. And then obviously a number of children who are under 13 who are engaging with these platforms and viewing a lot of this content too. And that there is an easy work that can be done there to safeguard children, to make sure that they're only viewing content that isn't harmful for them. So I think that the business model will continue to be a problem, but there are still steps that can be taken which make these platforms a lot more responsible in the way that they're operating.
Yeah, I'd agree. You could say that the ad model is a challenge, or causes challenges when you just have to keep driving more engagement to increase profits. But you can also point to just the current economic system, which puts so much pressure on executives to drive this quarterly revenue returns up and to the right constantly. And so the system itself, just like the system that leads to greater economic environmental destruction, is part of the problem. And these organizations, if you like, are being responsible to their shareholders by trying to drive additional revenue through driving additional engagement, through using different technologies at their disposal with very smart engineers to make that happen. So where does the fault lie when they're on the hook to deliver results? This is the challenge. Now, where does that lead us? And it's not just ad models, by the way. I mean, look at Netflix. I think the CEO of Netflix famously said the competition is sleep. Right? I mean, it's frightening to think that they want to make the technology so addictive, even on a subscription platform. They want to cut into people's sleep. It's very unhealthy. So I think one of the crises that we really have is a crisis in sort of conscious leadership, and enough people in high-powered positions that are in charge of these organizations or in a position to make decisions that will allow for new models to emerge, and some longer-term views to take shape, to allow for a softer, gentler approach to how people are treated by these platforms. By the imperative to make profit, it leads to this behavior. This is one of the challenges that we have. So more leadership that's willing to stand up to their boards or shareholders and say, actually, you know what? We're going to have to make some serious changes here. Now, Facebook did do some of that, but did they do enough is the big question.
There's also a question, I think there's kind of for me, increasingly, I think about advertisers paying for literally how many seconds I'm watching their ads.
Yeah.
Starts to feel like quite a flat model and quite outdated, when actually technology is getting to a point where it knows us better than we know us. I think Harari famously says that actually a computer could have told him that he was gay when he was 16 just by the way that he was looking and what content he was engaging with, but it took him a few more years to actually realize himself. Surely we'll be getting to a point at some point where advertisers say, actually, I don't want to just pay for time. I want to pay for emotion or sentiment or subsequent action. And I mean, whether that has a positive or a negative impact on exaggerating the way these platforms operate, I'm not sure. But I like to see a world where, advertisers are paying because someone is happy when they're engaging with content.
Yeah, you have to have new metrics, right?
They know more now about us other than just how much time we're spending on content. So maybe there are new models that can emerge.
Yeah, I mean, you have to design new metrics of success that are beyond engagement and watch time. This is what we're doing, with Uptime. It's designing for people's well-being and designing for empowerment. And you have to find new ways to measure that. It's not easy. It's a big challenge, but it has to be done to get to that next phase of evolution for us as individuals and as organizations, as a society, to have a kinder, gentler, way of looking at each other and the world to make it more sustainable and redefine success.
We have that exact same problem at Disciple. So when we're going out to meet with investors, they come to us with a bunch of predetermined metrics that we should be judging the success of our platform on. And those are all based on addictive use. how many of your MAUs are coming every day? If those people they're coming every day, how much are they coming every day? And is that usage going up every day? And we try and just say that's not what we're interested in. The outcomes we're looking for is when somebody builds a community with us, they have a defined purpose. Is that purpose being achieved? And we don't want to be measured by the amount of time, the amount of addictiveness of our product. We want to be measured on its ability to reach outcomes for the people who are part of those communities. At the moment, that's kind of a hard pitch.
Yeah.
And is there, it sounds like, as a layperson just listening to this, it sounds like, that there is the existing model whereby, it's difficult to get away from the fact that by making money, you need to suck in people's time. And maybe there will be something in the future which, changes that as a metric for advertisers. But it is difficult to get away from this idea that you need some form of intervention. And is there not a sense of, is there any sort of move towards a standard globally on this?
Not a standard as far as I've seen, but there are a lot of people that are doing good work in this direction. And, I think the platforms themselves are going to be very curious to see which ones evolve, because they need, in a way, to buy into that goodness. They need to buy into some wholesomeness. And, within both Facebook and YouTube, in my experience, it's very important for them to develop services that are the equivalent of eating your vegetables. They even use that sort of terminology within both companies. What you have is this sort of sugar rush, flow of information that can be quite unhealthy, even if the content itself is interesting. It's kind of like this fast food of media and information flowing through. So they're desperate to do partnerships and develop campaigns and social good programs and platform advances that will lead to more positivity and positive sharing. And whether they'll be successful be interesting to see, given the models that they have. But I think it creates an opportunity for new businesses to emerge in that space, and you see a number of them happening. And if you just look at some of the data on people feeling a sense of empowerment and well-being in using, certain apps, you get that from apps like Spotify, because it's not your relationship with Spotify is not predicated on the amount of time you spend on it. It's a fair value exchange, but it's a subscription product. So they don't judge whether you're a good customer if you're listening all the time. They just want to know that you're a regular happy user. And so what other services can we look at creating that have that sort of dynamic that optimize for people's well-being, not just for their time?
One of the transition to a subscription economy that's undoubtedly taking place with the sort of vast scale with things like Spotify and Netflix, but you're seeing it all over the place, micro communities with subscription appearing, is great. But one of the things that worries me about it is in 10 years' time, are we going to be a society where the rich subscribe and the poor are surveyed and they're sold? They can't pay for the service, so therefore they have to pay with their privacy and their data. If that happens, I think that data extraction and lack of privacy will be a lot more extreme than it is today, when the wealthy are free from surveillance because they're paying for their services, but the poor aren't.
But Benji, I think subscription aside, we're already sadly moving to that point. What I refer to it as the new digital divide. So we kind of have one digital divide, which is whether or not people actually have access to tech in the first place. And that's obviously really important, and it has become very clear, like in the UK through COVID, how a large proportion of the society are completely still segregated from even being online in an equitable way. But at the other end of the spectrum are people like, probably, I like to say all of us, who have become a lot more aware of our relationship with technology. We understand how the tech works. We're able to make conscious choices about how to engage with it, and to therefore be less manipulated likely by it. I think the term is less hackable, right? And so we're already in that point where we're kind of less tradable. Whereas you still have a huge portion of the society in the middle who are totally unaware and are using more and more and giving away more of their data for free without really recognizing what that means for them and potentially for their future. So I think, subscription aside, it's an education challenge that is already existing and something we should be really aware of.
Yeah, and I don't think there's, the dividing line between whether your privacy is protected or not is not whether you're a subscriber. I mean, I recommend you read this book that's come out not too long ago called, Surveillance Capitalism. And there are consumer products that people are buying and putting in their homes. They have been for many, many years, that are collecting information and passing them on to third parties and third parties and third parties. And it's very hard to know where that line stops.
Yeah.
So I think what you need are more organizations that will be transparent and be clear and actually make a stand, like Medium has done. When you subscribe, they say, we really care about your privacy and we're not going to share this on. Uptime, our company, we're taking a similar stance. So you have to, again, it's that sort of conscious leadership that's going to say, we respect you as a user. We appreciate that you've been exchanging a lot of information for things that are free, but there are other ways to do this. And also help educate people, as Georgie was saying, that free isn't really free. Free isn't really free, and therefore there may be certain things that are worth paying the equivalent of a latte or two per month, in exchange for not being harangued and guided through addictive tech to longer and longer and longer use sessions at the expense of your family and your personal relationships and your well-being.
I was just going to ask Georgie, actually, because this is kind of your area in terms of the impact of what this does to sort of children's minds and families and that sort of angle. I mean, can you expand?
Yeah. Yeah, so one of my roles at the moment is working as an ambassador for a company called Custodio, and we focus on family digital wellbeing and parental control. And we've been doing a lot of research recently, and it's really fascinating. So what we found is teenagers today are really aware that they're spending more time online than they want to. Like, they're aware that something's keeping them hooked, but they have no tools to manage that or to get off. They don't understand why it happens. And so yeah, I think there's a really simple and easy step that can be to just we need to overhaul our online education programs in schools and get kids to understand how the basis of the attention economy works, because once you understand it, it's much easier to then make an informed choice about whether or not you want to play in it. And that's not to say it's easy to get off these products, but if you kind of are more self-aware of how they're working, it does stack the odds a little bit more in your favor. So at the moment in schools, there's some online safety training, generally by ex-police guys. I've heard that it's often kind of, the really awkward, like sex ed kind of talks. They're not relatable. I think kids are really smart enough to understand how this stuff works and to be able to make better informed choice. And that would really help with things like critical reasoning to identify what is trustworthy news, what's not, how to try and analyze what sources of content your stuff's coming from. How to better protect yourself against people you don't know online as well. So it does have really good implications for online safety too. So yeah, I think there's a lot that can be done in education.
I mean, it strikes me there's a real prize there, actually, like boosting the education. I mean, I've got teenage children who have pretty much, surveilled every single obstacle that I've put in their way of trying to stop them from, seeing sites that they maybe shouldn't at the wrong times. And that's super challenging for parent right now, that aspect. So there's the kind of the tools that are available. There's explaining them. There's the education for the children. But all of these things you would think would be quite easy to put in place, but it seems it's not.
It is not.
Yeah, and it's always going to be hard too, because oftentimes the kids will be a lot more technically astute than the parents. They're the ones setting the passwords. They're the ones setting the codes. Yeah. They'll run rings around. You have to. What are you going to do? Turn off the Wi-Fi, and then they use the 3G, 4G, whatever it's going to be. It's very, very difficult, and the peer pressure is also great. So, but one thing that is happening, it's quite good though, that you are seeing some campaigns, and the tech platforms themselves, and Apple. You're able to set different modes of your phone to create a greater space for your personal life outside of your tech life. But it feels to me a little bit like they're doing it just because they're under pressure, as opposed to they really, really care. Although there are people inside these companies that do really care. Again, it's that profit imperative, and profit's not bad, but at the expense of people's well-being, that I think bears questioning.
I think I've noted. This is particular to my teenage son and his friends, but as they've kind of got old, as they got to kind of 15, 16 years old, I'm noticing amongst a lot of my kids' friends a fatigue with online life, and in many ways a greater control over it now than possibly adults and parents that I know. So they play too many video games, but they seem to have got to a certain point where they're like, this is all just a bit too much. I've been doing this since I was 7 and I'm bored of it now.
Yeah, there's a really nice back to like authenticity and recognizing when life is not real versus what is real. And I think that's
an enormous hornet just come in my room. Okay.
What's in your room?
Like, an enormous hornet about the size of my thumb just came in.
Murder hornets. Love it.
Murder hornets have hit Goring.
It wasn't your son coming in.
Well, it's interesting. A lot of the research for Gen Z shows that they are extremely aware and they care a lot about the ethics and the what's behind the thinking of different organizations and companies that they spend their money with, and they're very fickle, and they'll change on a dime if they find that their values do not match the values of that organization. And so I think you'll see a lot more organizations that are starting to move to keep and maintain and attract the younger audiences who are more discerning and don't have such a long time life allegiance to some of these brands at all. They will be the ones, the kingmakers for the new brands that come through. Let's just hope that there are some that emerge that aren't just, again, more sugar rush, TikTok type stuff, which is fun and interesting. Not to disparage what they're doing, but they're not exactly, leading the world, nor is it their stated ambition to lead the world to be a little bit more civil and a better place, for to leave our kids.
Can government? Is there a role for government here? Are we, do you believe that the state has the ability to kind of intervene helpfully on this, or do you think that it's always going to come from within?
I think the EU is, of anyone in the world, I think they're trying to create frameworks, but the frameworks have got to be established in the US. You can't have the EU. It's like Mark Zuckerberg's not allowed to travel to certain countries, so he just doesn't travel to them. It doesn't affect him. He carries on with life as usual. It's got to be something needs to happen in the US first. Otherwise it's fairly pointless.
But even then, the tech changes. It goes so fast. Just by the time any regulations come into place, they're oftentimes quite ham-fisted and can often be ineffectual. And by the time that they're in place, things have very much moved on. So again, it comes down to these organizations taking responsibility and having their own principles that they adhere to and that they're more transparent about. That's what the hope has to be. And the pressure then also can come from consumers who will vote with their time and vote with their with their checkbook, pocketbook, whatever.
We had a question on Cambridge Analytica, and I wonder, because that was such a seismic moment. The idea that our politics can be bought effectively or moved by influencing people's minds. Extraordinary story that was. And I guess as we're in this Wild West and hopefully sort of moving to a better place, do you think that situation can happen again, or do you think that they dealt with it?
Nothing's changed. It's going to happen again in November.
Well, it's still happening. It happens, I think, a little bit every day. It's just maybe used for less nefarious purposes. I actually had a guy who was one of the top engineers at Cambridge Analytica who applied for a job with us at Uptime App. And it was a fascinating conversation. I was thinking to myself, I don't know if I want to speak to this guy, but then I thought it could be interesting. And he was one of the engineers that did some of the first tests. Basically, they used worms to develop algorithms to do predictive behavior of where these worms were going to go. And then once they had the algorithms figure this out, they would do little nudges to get them to go a little bit farther than they were intending to go, to the point where they, as he said in his words, slithered their way into acid and committed suicide. The technology is so powerful by just suggestion, to get you, if you start to break off from the crowd, let's say a diverse crowd of different points of view, if you start to break off and surround yourself with people who have a similar point of view, you are highly susceptible to be influenced even further to the extremes in whichever direction that you're leaning. And this is frightening. And so I said to him, what can people do to defend themselves against that? He said, spend time with people you disagree with always, because otherwise you're in deep, deep trouble. It's frightening, right? And this is technology that's like 5 years ago. Just think about how powerful things, the computers and the algorithms that are going to be used for good in some cases, but oftentimes will be used to manipulate people to do things they weren't intending to do. And unfortunately, we're going to have to find ways to battle that, or just be a little wiser ourselves and learn that this stuff exists and be more discerning. But unfortunately, the tech is not working in our favor at this point.
There's an interesting thought from Alejandro Weitzman, who has suggested that public goods might be a way of sort of benefiting those companies that are able to have a more ethical perspective, and maybe they could be seen as public goods. Do you have a view about that?
Yeah, well, I was actually going to say, I think the problem with the regulation approach is that, you know, to Patrick's point, it's so slow. It's like whack-a-mole, right? It's kind of, they're trying to build up regulations to protect against one issue that's been seen over here or another issue, and by the time it's come along, there's something else that's more important to deal with. And how about we switched on its head and said, actually, what kind of society do we want? And then how is technology going to help us get there? And therefore, how do we regulate an environment which encourages those companies to help us get there? And so in that sense, you could create tax breaks or whatever. I'm not a regulatory tax expert. I'm sure there's a number of incentives you can put in place to accelerate the companies that are trying to do the right thing.
I think that's very, very true. And I think one of the things that would massively accelerate a transition to there being more choice for consumers is, and this would need to be a regulatory change, is that if I, citizen A, decide I no longer want to be part of Facebook and I want to join a new social network, I have the right to port my data with me. It should be in a transferable format that can be applied to a new network, because at the moment that's ultimately what keeps people bound in these networks. So some sort of consumer data portability would at least start to give people choice.
Well, I just remember how seismic it was when we were all addicted to our mobile phone provider because we couldn't get away from them, and then the government
exactly
changed the rules, and suddenly it was much easier to be able to do that.
So just being told you owned your phone number, not the network provider, was a huge change. I'd still be on bloody O2 if it wasn't for that.
Yeah, I know.
Yeah, there could be more incentives, but I think also just somebody kind of cracking it. Some organizations, already it's happening with certain brands where they just kind of strike a chord and people feel a real affinity because of their values, like Chobani yogurt. It's an amazing, thoughtful, conscious leader who did things differently and was rewarded handsomely, and he's done an amazing job. And you have companies like this that do break through, but it does take a different sort of leadership. And then the consumers will hopefully, gravitate toward those brands that they feel have their best interests in mind, and there'll be more of them. We have to go build them. And in fact, if you're not working for one right now, I recommend that you work internally to shift so that your company becomes one, or you leave to go start one, because ultimately it has to happen on a very basic individual level. Every individual has to take responsibility for this. You can't look to governments, you can't look even to CEOs and boards. You have to look to yourself to see, where am I putting my time, and where am I putting my money? And what type of future do I want? And therefore, what type of organizations am I willing to support or create, for that matter, to lead to the future that we want to see? And it's the same thing for green energy. It's the same thing for environmental concerns. You have to choose. Every single decision will have a knock-on effect. And so that's the kind of thing where I think people should feel empowered. And everyone is in themselves a very powerful force if they can just make those choices, as opposed to, it's easy and it's free and therefore it's not really hurting anybody. In fact, no, it's not the case.
Yeah, it strikes me that something like Checker Trade would be very useful in this space, where you had some sort of independent verification of what's going on, because obviously companies are able to tell a great story about what they do, and the question then is actually, can you verify that?
True.
So it comes back to that point about some form of independence outside of.
Yeah, but the younger audiences now, they can sniff out that inauthenticity. I do have some faith that they will sniff out, whether it's greenwashing or otherwise, people doing things for the sake of marketing as opposed to truly believing them. And over time it will pan out. Their reputations will die based on whether they are authentic in their intention to be supportive of their audiences and be out for the betterment of society, I hope.
And Benji, in your work with Disciple, are you seeing this come through with some of the groups and communities that are using your software?
Yeah, there's it's always quite hard to work out whether we're telling them why they've come to see us or they're telling us, because we're fairly heavy proselytizers about data and independence and this kind of thing. But a lot of the communities coming to us are coming out of a sense that and it's generally fairly vague, but it's a sense that if I want to build a community, I want to be the host of a community, I believe that the community is going to have value. then I want to ensure that that value is contained within the members of that community. And there is also a sense that they don't want that community to be, they don't want their community to be engaged, members to be engaging with the community within an environment that's hostile, and where they have no idea what else is going on, say within that Facebook feed. Has their member just seen a post that's shocking and horrible, so they're therefore engaging with their next post, which is from the community, and it's creating a sort of mental dissonance. They want them to be in a place where the environment is controlled. And actually a word that comes up a lot is culture. So a lot of hosts will say our community has a very independent and very specific culture, and we don't feel that culture can be truly expressed within a third-party platform. We need our own home to do it. And culture is, is a cornerstone of a true community. Every community develops a culture. All the members have a certain way of relating to each other, a certain vernacular. And you need a space that you control to be able to really nurture a culture within the community.
And do you have a sense of, it's obviously a subjective judgment whether a culture is a positive culture or not, but do you have a sense that there are some green shoots of these communities who
Yeah, they're wonderful. So, I mean, one of the things we're really proud of is the general sort of benchmark in online communities is that of every 100 people you have in a community, only 10 will be contribute to what's going on. 90% will just be passive, as they're known, lurkers. So they're just basically sitting passively telling the platform, give me entertainment or give me information. Whereas we see within our communities, it's 50-50. So 50% of members are actively contributing. They're making comments, they're posting content, they're being part of something. They're not sitting back waiting to be entertained. And that's a number we take we actively in the product team try and increase that number every month, that people are contributing. We don't want to build a platform of passive people being entertained.
And are you aware of the work of Tim Berners-Lee and his efforts to try and revolutionize?
Yeah.
And would you be able to explain a little bit about what he's trying to do?
I'll try to. So he seems to be trying to sort of reverse the internet that he helped bring around. So, for example, at the moment, Benji Vaughan, if I want to go on the internet, I go to Google, I go to Facebook, and whilst I'm at Google or I'm at Facebook, I hand over data and information as just general part of engaging with those platforms. He wants to reverse that. So my data never leaves basically me. The internet comes to me. I engage with it within a place that I control, and then it goes elsewhere. So there's no data trail left. And then there can be a exchange of data at my behest. So I can say to that platform, you may take this content or this data with you as an exchange, but it's a very fundamental shift in how it works.
So you're basically in charge, or
you're in charge.
You're more in charge. Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a Herculean task.
Yeah.
It's it does basically mean starting again.
Yeah. And is that, I mean, did Georgie, Patrick, do you feel that's a possible good way to go? Do you support that?
I definitely think we need to rethink how data ownership works and what the best model is. I also like the model which is like sort of equivalent to structural separation, whereby people who collect the data can't sell it onto their own platforms for free. They have to charge their own platforms the same price that anyone else would also have to pay for that utility. So a bit like with the telecoms networks, for instance, they all pay a wholesale rate for access. The problem is you're still as an individual passing on ownership of your data to a number of different entities. But at least there's potentially ways that you can be remunerated back for that, and you're not naturally leading to a monopoly ecosystem like we have today. So there are lots of different potential models, but I think so definitely something needs to happen about people recognizing that, as I said before, like giving over your data isn't free. And that's actually a very powerful tool that you're giving away.
Because that's ultimately the problem is having monolithic centralized platforms creates enormous utility in terms of user experience. How can you replicate that in a completely flat, decentralized manner? So, for instance, if I turn up at a new social media platform, I should have a bank of data about me that I can choose to interface with that platform and immediately get traction within that platform. I shouldn't feel like I'm having to kind of start from scratch. But it's, yeah, I'm skeptical that will ever happen.
Yeah, I mean, there are some possibilities with some new technologies, whether that be blockchain or otherwise, where you have that opportunity. But to break through is going to be, I think, very difficult. And it's interesting what Tim Berners-Lee is doing. The big tech platform signed up to that, group, and so they're in the tent, right? And so whether or not they will basically work against perhaps their best interest to make the changes that are being suggested is an interesting question.
And it's against their best interest because people will spend less time on their platforms.
Well, I just think that, look, I mean, there's some wonderful people in these companies who want the best for people in many ways. But again, there is a need to drive a business forward. And if it will happen at the cost of progress for the business and results that they're obligated to their shareholders to deliver, they will have to think twice, and it will be difficult. So you have to find something that works both ways, that is both good for people and good for profit, and I would say good for planet. And this is where, again, it's about, hopefully you get some creative minds that are thinking differently about new, triple bottom line businesses that care about people, profit, and planet in equal measure. And, shareholders should reward that. Boards should insist on that. Leaders should insist on that. I think that's where some change can come. But if you just, if you don't solve the problem of people needing to deliver the financial results, you just expect them to make these changes for the public good, that they would see that as irresponsible, unfortunately.
There's a question about how you might feel about the way China is leading the trend of a social point system for its system. I don't know about that, but do you have a view? Do you know about this?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
It's pretty
Well,
spooky.
my understanding of this is basically because they have so much surveillance. You are rewarded for doing certain things, like getting on a train to go and visit your parents at the weekend gives you social points, and kind of the social points then relate back to your standing within society. And equally, if you do something bad, and it can be in online or offline, that kind of subsequent credits event. I think it's just an extension of some of the data surveillance issues that we're talking about. I think
we're miles off
online, right? Sorry, Benji.
I don't think we're not a million miles away over here anyway. I mean, my life, what I pay for my health insurance, what I pay for my life has been impacted by how I'm valued by the algorithms.
Of course.
And my data is valued and passed on to a third parties. Yeah. It's just not as upfront as it is in China, because it would never be stood for here, but it's happening to all of us. I'll go on to Expedia and find out Experian and find out my credit ratings dropped, and it's probably because I've said something wrong on Facebook.
You never know. This is the thing, it's subtle, and I don't know if you've seen that Black Mirror episode where people have points. This is sort of what they say. And people in the West today, I think, aren't taking it seriously, the potential for these sorts of things to occur, because they go by, well, if I have nothing to hide, then it's no big deal.
Yeah, right? God, I'm so bored of hearing that.
Unfortunately, what people often will say, and also because it's quite subtle and it happens slowly. But the fact is, in China, if your credit score is low, then you can't get into that school or get that job or get that loan. And the consequences, if you're slipping down the ratings, or if you're hanging out with people who are of low quality or low score, that affects you. It's frightening, and you can see this potentially happening. And unfortunately, with the circumstances around COVID-19, it in many ways it gives an open door, an opportunity for greater surveillance in the name of personal safety, and as a means of getting out of lockdown. And people are probably going to be willing to trade that exchange for, quote, more safety and their well-being, just like they did after 9/11, which led to much greater surveillance. And once that is out of the bag, it's almost impossible to put it back.
Yeah.
You can never get it back. It's a slow creep. And so people need to be vigilant, and they need to be aware. But when you have that choice, what are you going to do? It's basically like, to go back to work, you need to have this app that basically says whether or not you've been tested, and therefore they then have your health information. It's a tricky one.
And I think it's a really interesting one as well. One of the things I've realized about this is because a lot of people I talk to about like the NHS tracking app, for instance, feel like because it's a technical thing, they can't possibly make the decision about whether or not they should use it because it's too complicated, and it's a decision that should be made by, technocrats, and they should simply follow government advice on it because they can't ask questions. But actually the questions are really simple. Like, when will this tracking end? What percentage of the population are actually going to have it? Are the people who are most vulnerable actually going to be able to use it? But sometimes the way that technology works, it makes us think it's all too hard and too difficult for us to make our own informed judgment about it, but it's actually not. And we do a really bad job at translating it for people to make good choices.
Well, just like privacy in terms of service, they're so long and complicated. It's just like click here, and people just, they do. I think in exchange for the convenience, they end up trusting probably more than they should.
But would that not be an easy thing for government just to come out quickly and say all of those things, that we're not going to use the data for longer than a certain period, and be very clear from the outset? I mean, why is it so difficult?
Well, they could, but let's take a look
They
at
want their options kept open.
how, every 4 years you have a different president in North America, or maybe you have one for 8 years, and you've already seen, this handbrake turn in policies, whether it be for environment or education, executive orders, all these different things that are transpiring, even turning around major international agreements that were signed by a multitude of different countries, whether that be Iran or the Paris Accords, right? So can you really trust, even if your government were to tell you?
Or something that's sinister, like you have in 4 years' time, you have another pandemic and you need it again for a different reason. And actually, these things are coming,
I think when any sort of sweeping technology like this is coming in, or whenever we're thinking about the implications of powerful private companies like Facebook, we should always try to think of them in a world where we have the worst type of government in power. Because it will happen. The worst type of government will come into power one day. And we shouldn't create tools that are going to make their power worse or more ominous. You always have to think. You have to make sure you're creating a technical architecture for the world that will stand up against people like Trump and worse.
Yeah, I mean, it's such a big topic, this, and it's amazing that we've actually had the ambition to try to tackle it. But I have to say that listening to this, that there does seem like such an important role for education, and I guess for people watching and listening, the basic ideas and tools that they might be able to use to kind of give them a bit of clarity. Do you have any advice for people out there who might be, wanting, to know, should they be on Facebook? Are there alternatives to Facebook? Are there, are there sort of ethical companies out there that they can look to? I mean, I imagine, Patrick, with Uptime, one of the reasons you went into doing Uptime is because it's accurate, educated content for people to absorb, and it's positive.
Yeah, I mean, I spent 7-8 years at Google and YouTube, and I was 3 years at Facebook, and worked with Instagram as well. And I mean, these are wonderful places to work, but and it wasn't the companies themselves. It was just, generally speaking, I started to get concerned about a few things. One, an assault on truth, and people not knowing who to trust anymore, and experts being downgraded in the public eye. And that was concerning to me. The second thing was this, the ideas around the attention economy and addictive technology, and people perhaps losing their sense of agency to make good choices when they don't even know what they're up against, these algorithms that are so powerful. And the third thing was, it's a rapidly changing world. The technology is changing exponentially around us, and people really need to stay relevant. They have to stay up to date. And where do you go to find information that will help you live a more sustainable, happy, constructive life? And so I got together with some folks and we conceived of Uptime as a place for safe, curated knowledge in the form of videos where we connect people with experts, best experts in the world on all sorts of topics that are focused around three main pillars. One, building a better self. Two, building better relationships. And three, building a better world. And we call this, the care triangle. It's, care for self, care for others, and care for the world. And so on the platform, we hope that people can come and connect with knowledge and connect with experts to be inspired and to connect with an innate desire to keep learning. So it's only through that lifelong journey and staying curious and continuously learning that you're able to stay relevant and stay ahead of the curve. And so through a platform such as ours, we hope that people will learn about privacy and learn about how to be a great father, be a great parent, or managing issues around mental health, or learning all these different things that they maybe touch on in school in some ways, but they don't really provide a safe, curated place for it to happen over your lifetime. And also for so many people that have dropped out of the school system in North America, only 60% of people are even finishing high school, let alone going on to college. So those people who have associated education with something negative, we're trying to provide a place that feels like a natural, comfortable home for them to stay curious and keep learning in an enjoyable space using some of these tools that we've gained on great platforms, like Instagram and Facebook and YouTube, where you have features that feel similar, but the content is all thoughtfully curated, and that's what we're trying to do. And we're also a triple bottom line business. Of course, we're looking to build a sustainable business model. That's our responsibility to ourselves, our shareholders, and our partners. But we're also caring very much about people and planet, and I think I couldn't think of anything more important to do.
And what are you up against in terms of the algorithm that's going to seek out your content versus somebody else's? How do you manage to get to the top of the list? What can you do to?
Well, we will have our own strategy, marketing, and looking to build audiences, and hopefully also, as it's a movement, it's kind of almost like a social movement for positive change. And we hope that will help us grow organically. The algorithms in search, you have to, in many ways, you have to be a very shrewd marketer to kind of get in there. We'll be utilizing some of that. I'm not sure what you mean, how we'll stand out. I think it's really just about building a brand and getting the right allies. We already have over 100 amazing experts around the world that are coming onto the platform to share their knowledge and talk about what we're doing, and partnering with different knowledge organizations like The Guardian and Humanity Rising to put out great content from people like Jane Goodall. We hope that will start to resonate. But it's we're under no illusions it's going to be easy. But we are fortunate to be, well-funded and with some very, capable people and long-term view on the investment that we've all put in.
Yeah, and I've got a question from Zach here, who has asked about what's going on elsewhere, especially with the riots in America. And the question that he is asking is, how can tech support and harness those deeply underrepresented stories and communities right now? Georgie, do you have an answer to that?
No, but I was going to say at the beginning, I think it's quite easy sometimes to get into kind of a really sort of pleasing tech bashing session. But actually, they already are quite good at doing this. There are communities around the world that would never have come together were it not for the platforms that we now have available to us. And I think it's the story that's often presented as the kind of the positive PR story again when the negative comes out. But actually, it's true that there are, people who would never have become stars, or people who've given great confidence to minority groups, people who have helped other people to find their true identity, who have rallied around really important causes, and the technology has enabled them to do that. So I think it is already happening. I think the question here is, how do we give those voices, those groups, more of a voice? And I think that comes back to the whole thing about the algorithms, basically.
Becomes
asking why is sort of global media channels, as they're described, not talking about the positives going on? But it goes back to what we were talking about at the beginning, because media and social media have known for a long, long time that good stories don't sell.
Yeah. that lead. And this is an interesting area, though, where unfortunately, I see media, and it's like a diet, like a food diet. You are what you eat for your body, and that's very true. And it's the same thing with media. And I think people don't recognize that their diet of media will help shape how they feel every day and how they show up in the world. And so, how can we rally around places that actually start to look towards a positive mental diet? It doesn't mean saccharine sweet news and the story of the skateboarding squirrel. It means places that actually look for solutions-based journalism, and and really supporting those sorts of organizations that slow the news down a little bit, that think more thoughtfully and deeply about that. Like Tortoise Media in the UK is a really good example, run by the former head of news at the BBC. These are the places that people can start to gravitate to, and nobody should be giving up these big platforms if they don't feel comfortable. I communicate with my friends and family all the time on all these platforms, but I also don't spend my day just mindlessly scrolling through stuff that's going to make me feel bad about myself or negative about the world, because that can happen super easy if you're not aware of the ease with which you can slip into that trap. So, utilize them for what they're good for, where you feel value exchange, but be cautious on overuse, and spend time on those new places and those new platforms that help you, that empower you. I think this is the real challenge. And that also do make a point to the question that was asked of providing a diversity of voices in it. You have to really work hard if you're running a platform to make sure that occurs. That means you hire for diverse voices, you take investment from diverse sources, you make yourself available in languages and in market to different folks and different backgrounds, economic and social economic backgrounds as well. And you have ways in which they can access the product, even if it is subscription, perhaps through sponsorship and other tools. It's the responsibility that has to be put into the company culture from the top.
And I guess there's a lot of positive stuff that we don't hear about for the same reason we were talking about before, is you just hear the negative stuff.
Yeah.
Underneath the surface, there is a lot of positive things. And obviously the ability to organize communities on these platforms, it can be something really incredible.
Very powerful.
And I guess, coming back to Medicine Festival, which is, we're trying to establish a community. And that community is to be established through contact and being present with people, and I guess what happens is when that finishes after the 5-day period of hopefully having a wonderful, incredible time meeting new people, that you then continue that community going onwards. And I guess it is about being in control of your time online and not having the technology be in control of you.
Yeah. And taking time to just value the relationships, personal relationships, even if you're at a distance. I mean, we're fortunate to connect with each other through video, but we have to really work hard to reconnect, not just with each other, but also reconnect with nature and keep our feet on the ground, despite the pressures, which will get even worse. It'll get even harder as we get into AR, VR, and more addictive tech and completely immersive environments. We just have to find a way to step back. And
yeah, I was going to make exactly that point, Patrick, because today we focus a lot on the platforms, but we haven't actually talked about the devices.
Yeah. And
my view is, from the moment you load one of these things up, your journey is controlled. You have a series of apps that are preloaded. The interface is heavily weighted towards consumption rather than creation. It's very difficult to create on a phone. It's very easy to consume. We are getting used to a very kind of frictionless way of existing. Everything comes quick, it comes easy, it's not natural. When you look at relationships, they're not like that. And with every subsequent improvement in the technology, the friction that we have goes more and more away. So it won't be long before actually I won't be dropping this, it won't be running out of battery, because it will be totally, seamless and around me all the time. And we aren't in control of how we're interacting with it now, when these physical frictions still exist, then we're going to really struggle in the future. So I think it's just about being conscious from the moment that you pick up a new device, exactly how your experience with that technology is going to be curated for you.
Yeah.
The screen metric of use that always, when I look at my phone, trying to see how much I've been using stuff, the number that always amazes and scares me isn't the amount of time I spend on my device, it's the amount of times I've opened it up during the day. That's the sort of weird knee-jerk, I must check my phone, and it's hundreds in a day.
Yeah, and there's lots of little hacks you can do. There's some people, and actually it's interesting, a lot of the top executives in Silicon Valley are doing things like making their phone black and white so that they don't get drawn in by some of the, the color candy, eye candy.
Yeah.
Turning off all the notifications, using different modes, removing all the apps that are not essential. And, if they're doing it, then they know something that everybody else should know. You have to be really intentional in managing the onslaught of attractive things that are going to keep you from not only yourself, but your family and those relationships that really are the things you should be investing more in. It's not easy, but we have to do it. There's a great book, Yuval Harari, you mentioned him earlier, Georgie, 21 Lessons for the 21st Century, where he says the only thing you can really do to defend against these things is to know thyself, to go a little bit more internal, spend a little bit more time away from the technology, and keep learning always.
And that life is literally where we place our attention.
Yeah.
And it is the thing we have. If we give it away without really thinking what we're giving it away to, then we're giving away our whole life experience.
Yes. And what do you care about? What you care about determines how you treat things. And so you have to really ask yourself the question, everybody, what do you really care about? And therefore then act in favor of those things you care about most.
I mean, it does go to the root of, understanding from the earliest age what these technologies do and what they're capable of. And I always sort of think that, Google Maps, which is so incredibly useful, and, I couldn't do without it. I do mourn my inability to remember places. And
it's dumbing us down a bit. Right? Dumbing us down. It's convenient, but you lose that part of your brain a little bit. That helps you remember.
I used to be known for my ability to sort of map read and find stuff. It's totally gone.
Yeah. It's like a telephone being able to talk for you in a second language or a third language.
Well, that's coming.
Where's the bathroom?
I mean, how many phone numbers do you actually know? Do you actually know your most loved one's phone numbers?
I know probably 5 phone numbers in the world now.
Yeah. that frictionless thing is really, really interesting. And I guess it just comes down to, especially as parents, I suppose, is trying to get on top of that with the young and make sure that they are better able to deal with it. And it goes from, but God, it's difficult.
But you have to set an example yourself. I mean, this is the thing, right? It's like, stay off your phone, kids, and then just one more email, just one more email. It doesn't work. It's hard as hell. But unfortunately, that's the way it has to work. Set a good example yourself.
Guys, I want to say a massive thank you. It's been brilliant to have all of this wisdom, and especially on a Sunday evening as well. And I'm very, very grateful for you guys spending the time, and everyone who's heard this and who will hear it. I think very fortunate to get all of this discussion, because I think it's very relevant for our times. It's a massive subject. I don't quite know how we really managed to tackle it, but we sort of did in a way. So I just want to say we've got some more webinars coming up. We're still in a big sort of decision moment about what's going to happen with Medicine Festival. Obviously, there's the whole issue of how do you hold a socially distant festival. But I think we've got some interesting plans, and we were going to go out to the community and talk to everybody who's bought a ticket and get their views as to how you think we should be holding the event. And the idea is the event is at the end of August, so there's still quite a lot of time, and hopefully we'll see an improvement in the situation, so we will be able to gather. But it's an unfolding situation. So I think quite soon we'll be asking for your views as to how comfortable you'll feel about coming to a festival, if there's any particular issues you want to look at. And obviously, we've got some plans on how to keep, vulnerable people safe or even away from the event, and to try and reduce the possibility of, of something happening, of spreading going on, and being able to track and trace. Potentially not with the NHS app, but we haven't worked that out yet. So anyway, I'd like to say a huge thank you again to all of you. And I think next week we've got Daria Tucano. Is Zach, are you there? You might have to help me out on exactly what the form is going
I thought I might, Josh. I thought I might. Well, first of all, thank you all so much. That was phenomenal. I learned so much, and it really put things into perspective. In regards to what's next week, next Sunday, we've got Daria Tocano. She's a Brazilian Indigenous activist. So she's going to be talking about Indigenous resistance and thought in times of the pandemic. We also have a special practitioner session next week. I think it's next Tuesday, which is with Rebecca Dennis and Kurukindi. Kurukindi's a Kichwa shaman. And it's going to be a breathwork session with some songs and wisdom from Kurukindi paired with that too.
Brilliant. Thanks, Zach. Thanks, everyone. And look forward to seeing you next week.
Thank you.
La